I think one of the weirdest sentiments that's been bandied about over the last 5 or so years is trying to reframe one of Marvel Comics' most popular characters, the Punisher, as a villain. Now, I've been a Punisher fan for a long, long time, and it goes without saying that as time has gone on, he's been the type of character that was basically the textbook definition of the term antihero. Thing is, we need to talk about exactly what it is that makes Frank Castle tick and try to properly rebut the argument that is being presented to make him out to be a villain. The first argument that I've seen out there, I'm going to call this the zeitgeist argument. Now, if you've seen my Witch for Mercury review, you can tell I'm not too pleased with arguments like this, because I don't think they're very sensible. Especially in this case, because of all the arguments that I've seen for Frank Castle being a bad guy, this one is the weakest. When I explain the argument, you'll understand why. Basically, because some soldiers and cops hold the character of Frank Castle, the Punisher, in high regard, and because the goofs making these arguments hold soldiers and cops in a low regard, Frank Castle bad, Frank Castle villain. Does it sound stupid? Well, yes, because it's a bad argument. It's completely stupid. What's dumber is apparently this reasoning is why they tried to change the character in the comics to be more villainous and gave him a shitty new symbol as well as devil horns and had him working with the hand. Then they killed him and substituted him with a dude who basically does the same thing that Frank used to do, but he was a secret agent beforehand instead of a Marine. This has all the subtlety of a sledgehammer going through a glass window pane, now doesn't it? Obviously, it's a stupid argument. The Punisher's a fictional character. You can't argue that the character is evil because people you don't like happen to enjoy stories about him. The Punisher, in different interpretations, was almost always a former Marine, and in the Ultimate Universe was a cop, and in the Thomas Jane movie, he was an FBI agent. Some people from those backgrounds will inevitably sympathize with his struggle as a character. More on that later. Let's use governmental figures as an example, since soldiers and cops count in that number. I fucking hate the IRS, and I don't really have a very high opinion of the FBI, or the CIA. I have a feeling, though, that there's quite a few people in those organizations who have worked for them and enjoyed a Superman story or a Batman story or something like that. I'm not going to sit here and argue some weird bullshit guilt by association nonsense with a fictional character. If Peter Strzok, one of the most corrupt FBI agents probably of all time, liked a Superman story, do I really give a shit? No. Now, I wanted to get that out of the way so that we could actually analyze the character of Frank Castle to really break down exactly why some people might see him as a villain, but I want to argue against this idea with some more context and understanding of the character. To begin, it is true that Frank Castle was first billed in the comics as a Spider-Man villain, but that's ignorant to the context of the comic. He's actually not a villain in that comic at all. Frank Castle was introduced in Amazing Spider-Man number 129. He was created by writer Jerry Conway and artist Ross Andrew as part of a larger arc where Peter Parker was dealing with a villain known as the Jackal. The overall story here is that Frank is not a villain at all. Hell, he flat out says in the second panel that he appears in the comic that he doesn't enjoy killing. But he's been tricked into thinking that Spider-Man deserves to die because the public thinks this time that Spider-Man had murdered Norman Osborn, which wasn't the case. The whole thing happens during the whole death of Gwen Stacy thing. At this point, the Punisher already has a reputation for going to war with the mob, which of course ties into Frank's origin story that the mob had killed his family when the family stumbled onto the mob executing someone. Well, as that issue goes on, Frank and Spidey get into a couple of tussles, but ultimately Spidey manages to show Frank that he's being played. And after this, the two shared an interesting relationship in the comics where they would actually team up on occasion, and Frank would even save Peter's life a few times, with the most notable being in the comic book Civil War, with this iconic page that you're seeing in front of you of Frank yelling for someone to get a medic after Peter turned on the pro-registration side during that conflict. Now, conflicts between Peter Parker and Frank Castle, or Frank's conflicts with other superheroes like Captain America, always came from Frank's willingness to kill, which is where we need to start talking a bit about, where some more sensible arguments about Frank's methods will actually come in. I think we need to talk a bit about how the superhero operates. Though some people will get mad with what I'm about to say, I don't care. Superheroes are largely considered to be an American mythology. And given that so many of the most popular ones were created during a time of what you might consider the golden age of the country, their morality reflects that of what we considered to be good at the time. Effectively, most superheroes believe in the concept of inalienable rights, as we'd see in the United States Constitution. So let's use that as an example to kind of set the stage of the beliefs of these characters in comparison to Frank. If we sat Steve Rogers and Frank Castle next to each other and asked them, do you agree with this part of the Bill of Rights? We'd probably get a yes for the following amendments. They'd agree with the First through the Fourth Amendments. But when we start getting to the Fifth, Sixth, and Seventh, that's when Frank Castle would probably start throwing in an asterisk. Those particular amendments have to do with the right to trial, and it's incredibly important to consider when it comes to superheroes. A dyed-in-the-wool superhero is going to believe that they are not the judge, jury, or executioner whenever it comes to crimes. Heck, this was what caused the divide between Batman and Ra's al Ghul in the film Batman Begins, when Bruce refused to execute someone. Frank Castle doesn't have that same idea, which is where the term antihero comes in, but where people start to think that he might be villainous depending on perspective. Generally speaking, an antihero is defined as someone who may lack conventional heroic qualities. In the case of Frank Castle, he lacks the respect that even superheroes have for the rights of villainous individuals. Some may not like the Thomas Jane Punisher film for whatever reason, but I feel like there are elements of that film that really nail exactly how Frank Castle thinks. One scene that comes to mind is when that version of the character has his declaration of intent before the final battle. He sees what he does as a war. He is specifically at war with criminals in general, like he says at the end of the film, killers, rapists, psychos, so on and so forth. It's a sentiment that's actually echoed by Microchip in The Punisher Max, issue 2 by Garth Ennis. Quick aside, if you want Punisher runs that I recommend the most, Chuck Dixon's Punisher War Journal and the miniseries Circle of Blood by Stephen Grant and Mike Zeck are awesome. But the definitive Punisher is Punisher Max by Garth Ennis. Anyway, Microchip flat out tells CIA operatives trying to capture Frank that war is exactly what he's waging, and anyone who knows Frank will basically tell you the same thing. The way Frank sees it, all the rules went out the window the instant that mobsters killed his family. If you don't respect the right that other people have to life, liberty, and property, why should Frank respect yours? That's how he sees it anyway. Now, one thing that should be mentioned is Frank only kills certain criminals. Generally speaking, those who ruin lives. This is not the type of character to be driving a motorcycle down the street, stop and shoot a jaywalker in the face. He has a code. Now, the question that gets asked at this point is whether or not this really makes Frank Castle an evil person, which is the interesting part. How do you characterize someone as evil exactly? Is their lack of trust in a system really what makes someone evil? I don't think that any concept of evil honestly applies to Frank Castle, because he's completely capable of doing very heroic things that we don't see from evil people, and is completely capable of kindness, mercy, and a lot of virtues that we as society would consider to be good. Everything depends on context. For example, if Frank Castle saw a little girl with a broken leg in the street, and nobody was coming to help her, he'd be the first person to pick her up and call an ambulance to get her to the hospital, and he'd probably keep watch over her until her parents get to the hospital to take care of her. He's also got an affinity for animals, and specifically has a soft spot for dogs. In a few iterations of the character, he has a pit bull named Max. Heck, in the second season of Daredevil on Netflix, Frank actually gets Max, and he surrendered during torture, not when he got a drill to the foot or got the piss beaten out of him by Irishmen, but when these goofy potato merchants threatened the dog. To take another instance from Punisher Max, let's go to Kitchen Irish, which is part of what Daredevil on Netflix is actually taking some inspiration from. In issue 7 of Punisher Max, a bomb goes off in an Irish pub, and the blast kills several people in the diner that Frank is in. Now, Frank's feeling some strong emotions and seeing the carnage that's gone on, but one man has a hole in his chest, and he begs Frank for help. So Frank does. He helps save the man's life until the first responders get there. Then the person who he helps gain his composure with the brutal situation then patches him up. In other iterations of the character, we see other moments of humanity from him. John Bernthal's version of Frank Castle from the MCU is honestly the most vulnerable we've seen him in media outside of comics, where there's quite a few instances of him and Micro where he's about as real of a bro as you could ask for. In the Thomas Jane film, the film ends with him leaving thousands of dollars for Spacker Dave, Bumpo, and Joan, plus all the good things that he does for them prior to that, like beating up Joan's ex and stuff along those lines. I feel like the most notable instance of his humanity, at least in the films or external media, was in Punisher Warzone. Now, I'm not really big on this movie. I might do a whole video at some point about Punisher in external media. But I really have to say, I really enjoyed Ray Stevenson's performance as Frank. He had stated that he read the entirety of Punisher Max, and it shows. This was probably Frank at his kindest at points, and you get to see the depth of him as a person. The gimmick of Warzone is that Frank killed an undercover FBI agent who was part of an investigation into the Cosa Nostra. Now, obviously this goes against Frank's beliefs because the guy was just doing his job trying to bring down the bad guys. So, in exchange, he offers money and his own life to the agent's wife, now a widow, fully willing to die as punishment for what he did. If Frank Castle was evil, at least in my humble opinion, he'd have written this off as just a casualty of war. But that's not who he is as a man. Keep in mind, he was a father himself at one point, and he knows the pain he caused that family better than anyone. This is also a guy that, when he was serving in a war in Vietnam, when somebody tried to rape a Vietnamese woman, he drowned the motherfucker for what he tried to do, because you're not going to wage a war like that. That's not who Frank Castle is. He's not evil. It's not who he is as a man. You can also see in Frank's mannerisms in the movie that, in regards to the agent's daughter, that Frank really is a guy beneath all the darkness and the skull motif, that he has a good man inside of him. I think this largely is what separates him from a villainous character. Frank oftentimes is compared to an Old West gunman for a reason. He dispenses his own brand of justice. And the interesting part of the journey that the audience takes with Frank is that we get to see that the people that he kills are those who truly deserve to die. The weird thing to me, though, is that Frank's not the only character who acts like this. Hell, look at Wolverine. He's really not that different. Like Frank, Logan also is a former soldier. He served in the military, but in Canada instead of the United States. He works off a similar code to the Punisher, has teamed up with Frank several times, and he honestly doesn't get the same amount of crap that Frank gets. Hell, Deadpool even operates on some similar wavelengths, but is a lot more insane. The whole gimmick of the anti-hero is the fact that you're going to forego the idea that the most vile of the vile in regards to criminals deserve to ever see a fucking courtroom. That's Frank in a nutshell. I feel like calling the man a villain is honestly absurd, especially compared to actual villains. Compare him to a character like Carnage, or the Joker, or Red Skull, or anyone like that, and I don't think you could be more dishonest about who Frank is as a character, unless you just don't know anything about him, in which case you just don't know, and you made a silly statement. It happens. Either way, if you're offended by a cop or armed forces member enjoying the character, again, like I said, you're just putting your personal politics in front of your ability to use logic. The Lord gave you a brain, not a potato. I don't care if you believe in him, he gave you a brain, not a potato. Shut up and use it. The fact is that whether you're a soldier, a cop, or just some dude out there, it's not hard to identify with Frank Castle as a character. Anyone can understand the feeling of losing someone, and just about anyone can understand how painful it is to see that the very people that you love would be murdered in front of you. Most people would be broken by that. On top of that, cops and military guys know firsthand how frustrating it is to serve your country like Frank did, and then see some of the vile things that you are expected to just glance over. Look, I'm just as much of a fan of the Constitution as any non-communist American out there. But I think anyone can realize that any governmental system run by human beings will have flaws, and bad things will happen. Corruption can run rampant, and rather easily at that. Things can get overlooked. Let's use a non-violent example. Think of Jussie Smollett. Yes, the great Jussie Smollett. Now, after one call from the Obamas, Jussie Smollett had the fake hate crime charges against him dropped by Chicago District Attorney Kim Foxx. It took a special state investigation to come in to get the fucker nailed to the wall. Again, this is a non-violent offense committed, but the situation's no less corrupt. The idea that a former president, no less, and his wife could make one call to one DA and get somebody who faked a hate crime basically off the hook is fucking scary, because imagine if it was a worse criminal. Again, this in specific, Jussie Smollett is a non-violent offense. I mean, he just hurt himself. But the situation's no less corrupt, and it's a good example of how one bad seat in the wrong place can fuck up how the whole system works. Hell, there's plenty of examples of worse people getting free because of plea deals or just by being FBI informants. No matter which way you slice it, the system has flaws. Situations like that are incredibly rage-inducing to the people who give themselves and sacrifice to serve their country in one way or another, whether you're a cop, fireman, soldier, whatever. And that's why they look at Frank Castle, why they look at the Punisher, and they hold him in high regard as a character. He's the person who goes outside the system to clean the mess when there is a mess to be cleaned. He's not some serial killer or psycho, and presenting him as such is just silly and dishonest. And I don't really think it makes you a bad person to honestly wish that some sort of judgment would come down upon bad people. In fact, I fully believe that many people like myself, who are people of faith, Christians, that we believe in the idea of God being a just God because we want to believe that at some point judgment will come for evil people that might get away from something like the law. Regardless, back on the Frank Castle thing, he's not some serial killer or psycho, and being presented him as such is just silly and dishonest. He's not Jeffrey Dahmer. He's not Charles Manson. He is a soldier on a mission. Okay, I know some Marines are going to want to kill me when I say that. He's a Marine on a mission. Put the gun down, Marine. I'm sorry. And the mission is cleaning up scum. That's his priority. It's never random, and it's not a mission where he's just going to pull the trigger randomly on people unless the writer just doesn't understand the character. He honestly believes that he's saving lives. And to be truthful, I think when you see the kind of people that Frank hunts down, it's hard to argue. To conclude, no, Frank Castle is not a villain, and I think it's a little disingenuous to call him one. He's not a villain by any long shot. Textbook definition of an antihero. And even though I don't agree with his methods, I can't help but be captivated by his stories and how he manages to walk a line where he does stare into the abyss, but when the abyss stares back at him, it seems to be fucking petrified. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. And given that this is a video with some violence in it, if you ever want to see the full uncensored version of videos like this, you can become a patron or a channel member. So on that note, to every single one of you, thank you so much for watching. My name is Micah Curtis, your favorite vanilla gorilla. Have yourselves a great rest of your day.